Okay, hi everyone. It's Friday, which is normally a psychoanalysis day at Sublation. Welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi. First, before I start, just say thank you to those people who have joined our Patreon. There's a link in the description below if you want to do that as well. We are recording a sort of B-side every week where we discuss the ideas that are discussed in the interviews with our guests, which has been really interesting to do, and it's great to see some people supporting that. So thanks so much. Quite a special episode for me today in that we're joined by Jeremy Tambling. Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
Fine, I'm good. Yeah, thanks.
Very good. Well, Jeremy is very important for me because he was my supervisor for my PhD. And I mean, really, Jeremy has written an enormous amount, upwards of 30, I think, monograph books on topics from Dante and Dickens within the world of literature, but through to Freud and psychoanalysis, Deleuze, Derrida, and critical theory in general, Adorno, Benjamin, and has also been teaching critical theory for a long career. He's now a professor at Warsaw and was at University of Manchester when I was there. And yeah, I mean, when and perhaps we can start with Jeremy, where it began for me. I want to ask you about your earlier career and stuff as well. But we met when I was a third year student and I was studying your module, which was called, I think, Emerging Modernities. And, you know, I don't mind. I want to say that at this point, I'd done 2 years of a literature degree and was pretty much quite disillusioned with it, really. I thought it was, you know, okay to talk about books, but I didn't really realize the sort of political implications of theory and the thinking of critical theory. And this module, which I think was about Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, really, wasn't it? As these theorists of modernity, really sort of transformed my feelings about the importance of literature and the importance of theory, and it sort of politicized me and made me interested in theory. So really, for you, you've been there right there at the beginning in starting me off and being interested in these things. So it's great to sort of reflect on it now with you. I mean, maybe we could start with what it was like for you. I mean, when did you become interested in critical theory, and what was it that made you, you know, dedicate your life to this you know, study of theory and thinking theoretically?
Well, thanks. That's a very good question. I want to start off by saying how different memories are, because that course, Emerging Modernities, where I have to say you were quite a star, that course was actually designed as a reading of the 19th century, and it was sort of pan-European. One of the things I dislike is the stress on English literature. I feel at the moment it serves only nationalist interests. And I was then and now interested in trying to teach comparatively. And I should say that I had the title of Professor of Comparative Literature when I taught in Hong Kong. And when I came to Manchester, I insisted on taking the title of Professor of Literature, whereas they wanted to make me Professor of 19th Century Studies, and I wouldn't have that because it seemed to me too much like a box to cramp myself inside. And I write on different things, not just the 19th century. Nonetheless, because I had been appointed to teach 19th century literature, I taught this course, which was whose title was Reading the 19th Century, and whose other title was Emerging Modernities. And so, of course, I was fascinated to teach Baudelaire, who, of course, is the great poet from whom the word modernity actually emerges. And Dickens was there, and the Brontes were there, and Blake was there, and so on. But the great commentators on the 19th century I took to be Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And I accept very much what Paul Ricoeur says about those three, that they are the masters of suspicion. That is to say, that you don't have to agree with almost anything the three of them have to say, but you do have to admire what they are doing, which is to question ideology and to take the answers that most people accept as the problems, which have to be addressed. To be a master or a mistress of suspicion seems to me to be not to accept the bourgeois answers, which the 19th century foregrounded so much. And I was interested in finding writers and authors who, in some ways, exemplified things that are in Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. One of those, of course, one of those themes, of course, is that of repetition. And I was and am fascinated by how each of the three develops a theory of repetition. Marx, obviously, when he says that the great events of world history happen, so to speak, twice. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Goodness knows what we're living through at the moment, since we've got way beyond farce. The case of Nietzsche, for whom the whole idea of the eternal return, with its implication of the complete breakdown of thinking of identity and thinking about single identity, thinking that there ever could be an identity to which things happen again. This seems to me absolutely extraordinary. And then, of course, the theories of repetition, which are in the Freud of 1919, 1920, the uncanny and beyond the pleasure principle, which are implied throughout Freud because they are theories which have to do with the repressed within culture, the repressed within history, things which come back because they are repressed, things which return in order to challenge and to remind us of injustice and to remind us of things which have been buried in history which should not be buried. These topics of history become so absolutely fundamental that they gave the justification for that title, Emerging Modernity. So that was what I wanted to teach, and what I wanted to explore, and what I'm continuing to explore. And for me, I want to say that theory can never go outside the practice of looking at texts. It seems to me to be very important that it does, and that, and for that reason, I come back to an earlier point. I think comparative literature is an essential here, because it is essential to lay texts alongside each other and not to have a single narrative of a nation or the single narrative of the idea of a language. It seems to me to be important that texts are looked at across the board. And I may say, I've always felt that English literature has suffered because actually those who are interested in theory have always had to, or have always been interested in looking at other literatures, and English literature has been often a way of trying to get out of the implications of theory, and it is concentrated on a kind of tradition which allows it not to think in the suspicious terms of theory.
Yeah, I mean, I might come back to this kind of funny story about rejecting the title of English literature, because I think this is important when it comes to the turn to theory, right? And the two roles that, in a sense, literature studies can play. One being to do, as you say, things like establishing national identity and history and creating a kind of official history, and the other precisely to be suspicious of those kind of ideological formations and so on, which comes from this turn to theory. But I suppose, I mean, you said just there, God knows what's happening now. But I wanted to think about this question of theory now as well. I mean, obviously, Jeremy's just written as well a great article on the turn to theory, with particular reference to Heidegger, which is in Sublation Magazine. I'll also put that link for people just below here. But I suppose what I wanted to say in relation to your work, Jeremy, is one thing that struck me at the beginning of this, and I think it's so interesting that the way you describe, for example, the question of repetition here with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. So much of those who do theory today, it seems to me, tend to oppose theorists to each other, right? So who was right? Was it Marx or Freud, or is it post-colonialism or Marxism, or, and especially with Nietzsche, we get this kind of almost rejection of Nietzsche. We almost as if we shouldn't use Nietzsche, and that of course stems from the connections, the biographical connections to fascism and so on, but also in other ways. There's a sense of reading to prove the theories wrong or prove them problematic. And it sort of occurs to me that there's almost two different kinds of reading, right? There's a kind of reader who looks to sort of falsify things or argue, like a kind of battle of the ideas, who's better than the other. And it seems to me that this has come to characterize the world of theory today, whereas your approach has been very much the opposite of that. It's what are the intersections between these different theorists, and how can their ideas be used together to produce something, I don't know, progressive or useful, I suppose. So that's one thing I just wanted to comment on and see what you thought about. And then the other sort of question was, well, perhaps with this point about repetition and modernity, you said goodness knows what's happening today, but are we still in a moment where Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud might be vital for understanding and combating the kind of modernity that we're in? Or do you think that this was particular to the 19th century, which you were talking about before?
Yeah, well, those are good questions. Historically, I started my interest in theory with reading Foucault, and I was given lots of advice at the beginning, and Discipline and Punish was a very early text I started to get really interested in, and then the history of sexuality, and then moving backwards to the Histoire de la Folie, the book on madness, and the other books and essays of Foucault. And one thing I was always struck by was that Foucault, talking about his own work as being like a toolbox, and urging people to use it like a toolbox. In other words, you take what you can. What Foucault is writing is stories about madness, stories about the clinic, stories about sexuality. What he rescues from the archive are always stories which the official, inverted commas, histories omit. And this ability to tell stories is part of this interest, I think, in the toolbox. The sense that there are things which have the ability to speak. Now, I've always used that as an excuse / reason for trying to be eclectic with theory, and I certainly have tried to work across theories as much as I possibly can. By the way, Foucault, of course, goes straight back to both Nietzsche and to Heidegger. Obviously, the fascist elements in Heidegger are appalling, and yet I think Heidegger is an extraordinarily important and schizoid thinker. And of course, Nietzsche is part of, I think, what we might think of as modernity. If Marx helps us to think about capitalism, and if Freud helps us to think about patriarchy, I think it's Nietzsche who does the most to help us think about what modernity means, actually, in his reading of the 19th century, particularly in something like The Genealogy of Morals. But the second thing I'd say about that is I've also take the title of Paul de Man's book, Blindness and Insight,
I think we've got
think
a.
of as
You just.
incompatibility between theories is also a kind of blindness, and I take that from Derrida and Foucault. I admire Derrida. How Derrida, who had these strong dissents from Foucault, that when he is at his most different from Foucault, still using Foucault's language, and that is soaked into his own vocabulary and his own positions, and I take that as a way of saying that the question of what theory is obviously difficult, but nonetheless the contaminations of thinker by thinker are important and allow us to think across them, or in fact require us to think across them and to think actually better than they do. So again, the Derrida-Lacan debate, for example, the Purloined Letter, where the arguments are extraordinarily difficult, and it would be a very clever person who felt they could make an ultimate differentiation and say this one is right and this one is wrong. That is another encouragement, I think, to allow theory to contaminate your thinking completely, as it were, and not regard yourself as a purist. As I take a Hegelian Marxism versus, say, a modernist Marxism. If that sounds too easy, well, perhaps I put my hand up to that. But I also think it is important to, not to take theory in quite such differentiated a form as theorists would like to do. I think their own blindnesses and insights are very important here. If we're thinking about theory now, what was that famous remark about, what difference did the French Revolution make? The answer is it's too early to say. I do feel the same about theory. Theory came in the 1970s or 1980s into the British Academy. There was a time when everybody was reading introductions to theory or writing them. And then I think there's been a huge backlash. It's even possible for someone like Liz Truss, in her former manifestation as minister for whatever it was, to warn people against Foucault, and to think that she was doing something important in this kind of virtue signaling in doing that. Now, the point of my statement is this: I think there has been a huge backlash against theory in the name of a kind of historicism, and in the name of a kind of elitism, which I think is the opposite of what we want, and which has made something of a kind of Chinese wall even around literature. I think all these things are possible, and so if we say that theory has failed, well, I say it's failed first of all because of the opposition to it, not because of something inherently weak in it. And I would say that the opposition is actually a marker of a success it's having, and so I'm not particularly put off by that. What I am put off by is the point that theory became in many universities something which you which you taught and became a series of bullet points. And it could be taught, and it was taught sometimes appallingly badly. I've seen it taught really badly, but by people who hadn't actually grasped the first implication of how oppositional theory can be to a traditional view of literature. And that kind of sanitizing of theory, that I think has been its problem. And that's why I wanted to go back to Heidegger, because I've been teaching Heidegger for a very long time, and I can say I've read all the books on Heidegger, not all of them, but as many as I could bear to. And I've read a lot and gained a lot as well. But I came to a point in last July. I just finished a book which is actually on capital punishment. It's a comparison of the way Dickens writes about that subject and Derrida writes about it. And I got the book off the publishers, and so I actually had nothing on my plate. And I thought, right, this is the time I'm going to actually sit down and read Being and Time from cover to cover and see what I really think about it. So, well, I'm not sure what I really think about it, because I found it threw up more questions than I could possibly grasp. But I'm fascinated by that text, and I'm fascinated by Heidegger's whole trajectory, and the way he has been, he's usable, and yet and just how dangerous he was, because he was usable by the right as well as by the left.
Right.
I think that I just wanted to reread the theory. That's my simple point, and I think that's what we must do.
But I mean, I have a few things to ask there based on what you just said. I think it's fascinating what you just finished by saying, and I would like to ask you a bit more about this question of how theory can be used by the right and the left, because on the one hand, this is the so-called risk, which has led to Heidegger and perhaps also Nietzsche being kind of dismissed by members of the so-called progressive left or whatever. But on the other hand, what I sort of took from what you just said was that it's the radicality and the potential subversiveness of this theory to, let's say, establishment norms, or perhaps we could say neoliberal capitalism, or whatever we might use to describe the current present moment. Like, the fact that it can be used for the right and the left in opposite is also testimony to its kind of, radical or subversive potential for challenging the sort of status quo of political thinking or cultural thinking. Maybe there's something in that. But I also wanted to go back to something you said earlier in your answer there, where you said that it was really interesting, I think, provocative way of putting it. Freud as the theorist who allows you to understand patriarchy, Nietzsche as the theorist who allows you to understand modernism, and Marx as the theorist who allows you to understand capitalism. I mean, of course, it's an interesting statement, and I instinctively agree with it. But people will often say that the problem with Freud is the failure to understand patriarchy. So it'd be interesting to hear what you thought about that. But also, do you think these are the sort of three prongs of, that you said that in answer to the question of what do we do with this now? Do you think that capitalism, modernity, and patriarchy are a useful way of thinking about sort of three enemies we're up against today? Those would be my questions based on what you just said.
Yeah, well, they're provocative, and I'd just like to come to that. I'll try to answer your last question first. You talk about the three prongs. If I said that Marx helps us think about capitalism, well, that certainly, that's a name for a whole. For a whole debate, and it's a name for a whole discourse when to think about capitalism. It may start with Marx, but certainly doesn't finish with Marx, and it certainly goes into, for example, Benjamin and Adorno in the 20th century and beyond. So if we're thinking about Freud, you asked me about patriarchy. Of course, I accept that Freud has distinctly disturbing views about patriarchy at times, and yet I also think, and I very much like Juliet Mitchell's now quite old work on this subject, that Freud is also an analyst of patriarchy, and that he has, as it were, taken the lid off it and allowed us to see what it is, and in doing so has opened up the whole question of gender, and that question of gender is absolutely inseparable from questions of the symbolic order in which we find ourselves, and the relationship of that to capitalist ideology, etc. If I'm talking about modernity, in the case of Freud, of Nietzsche, there I'm thinking about modernity as that project which Foucault follows Heidegger on, the idea, the technological, the question concerning technology, the way in which technology enframes and brings things into the open, makes them what Heidegger calls standing reserve. I mean, this is the panoptical thought of Foucault. This is the production of the subject, the construction of the subject, which is the theme of the history of sexuality. This is what confessional practices are all about. And early on in my career, I wrote about a book on confession. This has always been a subject which fascinates me. The way the subject is being encouraged to speak about herself or himself, and to take that confessional discourse, how it does construct in its own way the subject is. I mean, that has to do with modernity for me, and that has to do with how modernity is this project to bring out identities, to bring out subjects for use, and then for being discarded.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So that's my answer to your third question. If I could go back to the first one, we're talking about theory being used by the right and the left, and of course it is. I agree, but I would say that what unites all these people, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, is that they are astonishingly interesting readers. Freud, I've just finished editing. This is the other big project I've been doing over the last few years. I've been editing a handbook on literature and psychoanalysis, and it comes back to me again and again and again just how much good reading there is in psychoanalysis, how much good reading of texts there is, and I suppose I'm a great believer in reading and in good reading and rereading. Rereading is something that Barthes has a fascinating page on I think it's page 9 of S. Said. It's a wonderful little
Page 9
discussion of the importance of rereading. Otherwise, those that fail to reread are doomed to read the same text everywhere. That's what he says. Now, this idea of reading, it's something which I think university departments should practice, and it's the way of seeing that every text has its own return. The text is never quite what it seems. It's never as single in its thrust as it seems to be, and that applies even to the most engaged texts, the most politically engaged texts, and for me, it's a reminder that if a text is used by the right and the left indiscriminately, or it has got that potential, I think there's been a failure of reading, because ultimately, I feel that there's a failure of reading which marks out the right, because it's protecting its own position, and what the left must do is not protect its position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually there's a lot of paranoia on the left because there's too much protection of positions.
Yeah.
And that protecting of positions comes about from a desire to read the same text in a univocal way, and not allow the plural of the text to show itself. And I think that the right does that characteristically because it's preserving privilege, it's preserving status, it's preserving gender positions. But there's no reason why the left should do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's good, really, really good answer. And I mean, just follow up again on the question of modernity. I thought one of the things you said there that was really interesting is modernity. You defined modernity there as this sort of function of bringing subjects out or bringing identities out for use. And I think that's really interesting in today's political context, that, you know, we are in a sense encouraged more than ever to think of ourselves as identities, as subjects. And so I think this definition of modernity is very useful, and I'd be interested to know just to hear a little bit more about what you mean by that. Presumably, you know, bringing subjects out for use is a capitalist thing. We're all celebrating our identities and their multiculturalism and diversity, but actually, are these identities being produced for the benefit of capitalism, for use, as you put it? So that was one question, and then sort of similarly with these terms, modernity, patriarchy, and capitalism, I wonder whether, rather than sort of three prongs, isn't capitalism sort of, or class, if you want to put it that way, isn't that the one that comes first? And patriarchy, aren't patriarchy and modernity symptoms of capitalism? It would be one way of asking it, I guess.
Well, that's obviously it's a very important question. I always used to say that that capitalism and patriarchy, patriarchy, the critique of patriarchy without the critique of patriarchy without the critique of capitalism, maybe something like California. The critique of capitalism without critique of patriarchy is much more like China. It seems I mean that's a very easy answer, but my point is, I think that it is a legitimate question to ask: which comes first, patriarchy or capitalism? The structures of patriarchy, which permit a kind of monologism, permit a kind of which reinforce a symbolic order, which inherently, for example, excludes women's language. I mean, that is a very important thing, and I cannot make up my mind, and I don't know that it can be made up, as to whether that precedes or comes after capitalist structures. It seems to me that both capitalism and patriarchy just work together. And if we're going to argue that that we're being used, and that's the inherent argument in modernity. And I'm not quite sure I got all your question because there was a bit of a breakup in the transmission. If we're going to argue about that, it worries me that we may want to celebrate an identity, but actually that is also being used.
Yeah.
And it's the potential for any statement of identity, for example, to be co-opted and to be, as we're used in evidence against you, or used in evidence which preserves marginalization. That's something which I find very necessary. I want to insist upon it. Actually, that's why I wrote about confession way back in the 1990s. There's something in me which wants to resist confession, or resist its opposite, as it were, the kind of celebration of identity. Ultimately, it's not something I accept.
I mean, that would be, I think, as a last question, I think we should talk about this and the new book too. I mean, the death penalty issue, but which you wrote about before, towards, I think, the beginning of your academic work. With I remember reading a book on Dickens and confession and the death penalty. But on what you just said, I wanted to follow that up as well. You know, we are in some ways, aren't we, a society, a confessional society, in the way that Foucault described, and with, you know, social media platforms and individual, in all this kind of individual confessional networks that we now live in, we're in a sense more confessional than ever. And it is, in a sense, of course, I mean, I know that, you know, panopticon is what you talk about in your first year of a literature degree, but at the same time, it's important here that there is this kind of confessional trend. And I think that I've never heard anyone connect that to the celebration of identities and what people might call identity politics in the way you just did. And I think that's really important, that, you know, this confessional mode that seems to celebrate identity, it in some ways puts you at risk of it being used against you, or it being commodified, or it being used to maintain the system and structure of exploitation, which it might seem like you're opposing. Would that be a fair way of putting it? And also just tell us what your sort of main, you know, what your main interest in confession as a topic has been.
Yes, well, I think I became interested in Foucault through that question of confession. You know, Foucault says Western man, and of course the word man is both problematic and also key to the point. Western man has become a confessing animal, and in saying that, Foucault is drawing attention to this compulsion to confess, and that actually is a title from Reich. It's a psychoanalytic title, The Compulsion to Confess, and it's a reminder of the point that when a crime is committed, people confess to the crime who certainly have not committed it. There's an intriguing example of that in Crime and Punishment, but police note all the time that people like to waste police time by actually confessing to crimes that they never committed, and that has to do with issues of guilt, which Freud is so articulate about in Civilization and its Discontents and throughout his work, and which Nietzsche is also so brilliant about in sections in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where guilt is seen as again the problem of our civilization. Now, all of those things, of course, connect with the way in which gender issues and sexuality have become key to thinking about modernity, and they are issues, it seems to me, which are absolutely dividing, I would say, not only America or Britain or Europe. Think of the absolute conflicts between very right-wing countries, where Orban or Trump, Le Pen, the present state in Italy with Meloni, and that's not even to say anything about what's going on in Russia. There are times, this is a parenthesis, there are times when I've even wondered whether the attack on Ukraine is actually an attack on emerging modernity. and an attack upon just the kind of ambiguity of sexual identity that is being perceived to be happening in the West and in China, in the West by Russia and by China. So I misphrased that. What I've got in my mind here is that these issues which confessional practices awake are very ambiguous. Bakhtin talks about confession as a very creative thing, and that is very interesting. Foucault, just as interestingly and very persuasively, talks about it as in a way a kind of repression, because in fact it's denying the other. It's denying the other, which doesn't enter into confession, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an incredibly interesting possible avenue. I mean, so in this sense, the Ukraine war becomes a sort of symptom of a kind of culture war that happens at the level of sexuality. I don't think that's been said. Yeah.
It's not the first thing I want to say either. I mean, the Ukraine war is an immensely complex issue and a terrifying one, and I don't want to minimize its seriousness in any degree whatsoever. Nonetheless, I have heard a sort of language which is the language of culture wars used against it, used to justify it, and I think there's an animus there which is maybe partly conscious and as well as partly unconscious in the way in the way it works, and which makes the Ukraine war an absolute intensification of something which is happening right the way through. Trump versus Biden's America is another example of it.
Right, I know, I agree. I mean, and they have to be seen as symptoms of emerging modernity, right? Rather than
they do, and in that sense, that's why we cannot talk about the failure of theory. Theory seems to me to be absolutely necessary to shine a light on what is happening. And if I keep on observing that there's a sort of 50-50 split, or very nearly a 50-50 split, and by the way, I haven't mentioned Brazil, but I should. I'm terrified by what's going on there too. If we mention these things, then it seems to me that there is a split between those who are prepared to open themselves up to the possibilities of theory, which I would say at their best are those of what Bataille calls transgression. And transgression is not just doing what you like. Transgression is putting yourself into question. It's putting yourself and identity into question, and seeing that these things are open-ended, then they're not sealed off, and they're absolutely not there to be protected in some kind of exclusive way. And if it comes to if we're thinking in those terms, it seems to me that the work of theory, whatever its differences and however much individual theorists may differ from each other, has an important project, and there is a dangerous reaction to it, which uses all forms of coercion to prevent it happening.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I mean we've covered so much. I think it's a great place to stop, and I looking forward to picking up on some of it with you next time we meet for a drink, especially this California and China and capitalism and patriarchy, which has one and which has the other, and so on. I think it's extremely interesting, and loads of the stuff we've talked about today. We've covered an enormous amount, and people will be extremely interested. When will what's the new book called, and when will that be out?
They're both coming out from Bloomsbury, which is my favourite publisher at the moment, and one is is the Bloomsbury Handbook to Literature and Psychoanalysis, which should be out in May, June, in which I've got proofs for at the moment. And the other is the death penalty in Dickens and Derrida, the last sentence of the law. I have to say, that book I've enjoyed writing hugely, and I hope it's got things new in it.
Well, I'm sure people will.
And that book should be out sometime next spring.
Okay, so 2 forthcoming that our listeners can check out. So thanks so much for joining us, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for listening. See you all next Friday, I hope. Interviewing Mary Ruti next Friday. So, and that was actually in response to some listeners' demands to get Mary Ruti on. So glad to oblige. And so thanks everyone for listening, and thanks Jeremy for joining us today.